Israelis are a little hot under the collar when they think about that prospect.
Speaking with David Gilbert, a freelance Middle East correspondent. David, Syria obviously signed on to these talks. It's in their interest, I imagine, to a certain extent, to have a certain amount of peace in the Middle East. But what's at stake for Syria in terms of jumping onto this into this conversation at this point?
Syria is a very, very difficult can of worms, Jessica, because, you'll remember a couple of months ago, Israel reportedly bombed a nuclear facility in Syria. Now, I can tell you from some sources that certainly are not going to go public at this stage, that was not just a strike on a nuclear plant. It was actually a strike on a plant that was putting together nuclear weapons. In other words, they had already gotten plutonium, probably from the North Koreans, perhaps from the Iraqis from several years ago, and they were putting together nuclear weapons. Now, the Syrians, the fact that this program has been literally blown to bits. There's nothing left anymore. It was buried under thousands of tons of sand. They're feeling a little bit more vulnerable these days than they did only 2 months ago. So the Syrians certainly looking to be a member of the Arab League once again, looking to be in better graces with the Saudis and with the Egyptians and other Arab countries that they haven't really been quite so close with over recent years as they've come closer and closer to the Iranians. Now, the Bush administration idea, and certainly the Israelis are in favor of this, is to try to separate Syria from Iran. Iran, of course, being accused of developing nuclear weapons and being really the key member of the axis of evil, in President Bush's words. But the Syrians, on the other hand, there's some hope, at least, that Syria could be taken away from this axis of evil and could become part of the moderates. Now, I don't think Bashar Assad, at the end of the day, is really somebody who truly wants peace with the Israelis. If he did, he could very easily shut down Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah, which are operating out of his territory. He doesn't do that. And the fact that he talks about peace is certainly not enough, at least from the point of view of any Israeli prime minister that might sign a deal with him.
National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley said yesterday that the president's got his own ideas about, how to advance this, and he's going to make an opening speech, but that he isn't going to advance any of his own ideas on how to achieve this. Well, doesn't it make sense, if he actually has some ideas of his own, if in fact he does, that even if he doesn't advance them himself publicly, that he has his people behind the scenes quietly trying to advance ideas that he actually thinks are going to make sense, rather than leaving it to people who may not in fact have ideas of their own?
Well, Victoria, I suspect that there is quite a lot of that going on behind the scenes. I know when Secretary Rice was here in Jerusalem, there were certainly American ideas that were being proffered to both sides. I don't think there's any lack of ideas coming from the State Department and other areas. I think the real issue is that, anybody who knows Arabic knows that there's no word for compromise or negotiations in Arabic. It doesn't exist. There's no concept of you meet us halfway and we'll meet you halfway. And I think that every time that the State Department or Secretary Rice or even the Israelis, for that matter, move a step forward in terms of making some sort of a compromise, some sort of giving up something, the Arab side doesn't typically accept that. They don't. Yasser Arafat was the greatest example of it back in 2000 when he was at Camp David with Prime Minister Barack from Israel and President Clinton at the time. They kept offering him more and more and more, and he kept taking steps back and saying, no, keep offering more. And then, of course, the Western side continued to offer more, and Mr. Arafat in the end said, no, thank you. So, again, if you talk to people on the street in Arab societies, it's just a different way of thinking. It's not a better or worse way of thinking. It's just a different way of thinking, and they don't have this concept of compromising. So even if President Bush or Secretary Rice were to proffer these ideas, much as President Clinton did 7 years ago, it's not clear to me that Mahmoud Abbas would be willing or able to make the compromises that are necessary to bring any kind of end to this conflict. And by the way, there's one other point, sitting all the way over here in Jerusalem as a student of history, I'm not aware of any time in the history of the world where the side that won all the wars is being forced to compromise to make peace. Typically, the Nazis, they were forced to bend over backwards to make peace because they lost the war. The Japanese, had to make concessions in order to make peace. The Israelis actually won all the wars here, and instead they're being asked to be the one to compromise, whereas it could be it's the PLO that ought to be the one that would be the one to compromise here.
And they're never going to compromise on the right of return.
It appears not. Look, if this poll is correct, 68% of the folks living in the West Bank and Gaza are adamant about the right of return. I think you're right. I don't think there is an Arab leader that's alive today that could compromise on it. Mr. Arafat might have been able to. He's not around anymore. Mr. Abbas is certainly no Mr. Arafat, and at this stage, you're right. I don't think anybody's going to give it up.
David, there was an interesting piece over the weekend in the New York Times by Thomas Friedman saying essentially he doesn't get why the Bush administration is focused so much on the Israeli-Palestinian question when, we've seen things improving in Iraq. This might be a great opportunity for Condoleezza Rice to go in with all guns blazing and finally forge some sort of diplomatic step forward, a diplomatic surge, if you will, there. In Jerusalem, is there a sense of that as well? Is there a sense that why is the United States getting so involved in the Israeli-Palestinian question when they have this open question in Iraq?
Jessica, that was definitely the question that was asked about 6 months ago or so when Secretary Rice really upped the ante and started coming here quite often. Many Israelis were looking around at the political constellation that existed both in Israel and in the Palestinian Authority, realizing that both Olmert and Abbas are incredibly weak, and it's very unlikely that anything good is going to come from these negotiations. And many folks were really scratching their heads and trying to understand what was going on. And that's why the cynical explanation of, well, Mr. Bush wants an achievement here in the Middle East, and he thought perhaps he could cajole both the Palestinians and the Israelis into giving him an achievement. I think that's overly cynical. I don't think that Mr. Bush in the end wants a legacy that's going to result in even more bloodshed amongst Israelis and Arabs in this part of the world. Why they aren't going to Iraq, it's a very good question. I don't have a great answer for it. I think that ultimately they're trying to make progress in terms of the military situation, and I think little by little they're starting to realize that maybe there isn't a compromise to be had amongst these various political factions and religious and ethnic factions that are tearing apart Iraq today.
All right, David, we really appreciate you joining us this morning. David Gilbert, who is a freelance correspondent in the Middle East.
Thank you.